Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Department of Politics and International Studies, I would like to welcome you to our third SOAS Centenary. My name is Salwa Ismail, and I teach in the Department of Politics. Before I introduce our very distinguished speaker this evening, I would like to thank the organizers of our Centenary talk, in particular Marina English, who has done tremendous work in organizing tonight's event, as well as Dr. Reem Abul Fadl, who was also the co-organizer. Please give them a round of applause for all of the work they've done. It's a great privilege and honor for me to introduce this evening's centenary speaker, Professor James Piscatori. Professor Piscatori is a leading scholar of the study of Islam in world politics, currently based at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. Professor Piscatori is a world scholar who has taught and enriched academic and university life across the globe. He was previously head of the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. And prior to that, Professor Piscatori was fellow at Oxford, at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, as well as fellow of Wadham College at the University of Oxford. He has held professorial appointments in the Department of International Politics, the University of Wales, and the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. He has also been senior research fellows in a number of research institutes like the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Professor Piscatori is the author of very well-read and influential works, including Islam in a World of Nation States, and he is co-author of Muslim Politics, of course a staple on all of our postgraduate courses. He is the editor of Islam in the Political Process and the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Islamic World, as well as co-editor of Muslim Travelers, Pilgrimage, Migration, and the Religious Imagination. In addition to works on modern Islam, he has written on the politics and international relations of the Gulf. He co-edited, for example, Monarchies and Nations, Globalization and Identity in the Arab States of the Gulf. He has also served on numerous international collaborative committees, and I would just name significantly the Committee for the Comparative Study of Muslim Societies of the Social Sciences Research Council. He has also been co-editor of the Princeton Studies in Muslim Politics series. I'll just say a few words about Jim's work that I'm sure many of you have read and familiar with and know how influential and inspiring it is. Jim's research and writing has focused on themes central to the study of Islam and Muslim societies in the modern period. In particular, his works have illuminated the complex and diverse ways in which Islam, as a tradition, informs Muslim actors' engagement in the international arena, as well as in everyday life politics. His scholarship, attuned to the multitude of struggles among Muslims across different settings over meanings and symbols, has drawn attention to processes shaping and remaking contemporary Muslims. Processes that gave rise to the plurality of interpreters and contests over who speaks for Islam. Jim's work has invited researchers to be attuned to these contests and to the diverse voices of the claimants and pretenders to Islamic authorities. As a scholar of Islamic political thought, Jim has worked on the ideas and concepts that articulate Muslims' aspiration for community and solidarity, and that also mobilize for competing political projects. Particularly salient for understanding recent developments in Islamist politics is Jim's work on pan-Islamism and Islamic transnationalism, and on the contemporary meaning of the Umma, community of faith. Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished speaker, Professor James Piscatori.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salwa, for that very lovely and over-generous introduction. Gosh, I kept thinking I'd like to meet that person. Thank you so much for that. It's sort of an out-of-body experience to hear about all of that. I'm sure I didn't do half of that, but thanks ever so much for it. And thank you all for coming. I should say how honored I am to have received this invitation. And of course, I send my best wishes to SOAS on its centenary. I'd like also to add my thanks to those of, as Salwa mentioned, to Mark Laffey for the invitation, Salwa for your invitation, the entire department, to Marina English for all that she's done to put this together, and especially to Reem Abul Fadl. I won't embarrass her by telling you what she was like as a student, but I do hope and I trust that SOAS realizes what a gem they have in her. So thank you very much, Reem, for all your help. It's very gratifying to see so many experts in the audience on this subject. It's more than a little daunting as well. You could speak on this subject just as easily, and I think even more convincingly than I can. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to try out some ideas, which pretty much are a work in progress. They build on some of what Salwa was talking about, my interest in Islamic transnationalism, but I want to focus specifically on the concept of the Ummah, which, as you know, has been quite central and is central to many of the debates in the contemporary Muslim world. It is, in a way, kind of an abstract discussion that I'm going to proceed with, but I hope that you'll see the relevance of it as it proceeds. Let me show, I'm going to leave this slide up for most of the discussion, so it is, in effect, the summary of what I'm going to say. So in a way, it would be, I think, perhaps help to clarify what I'm saying if you want to refer back to it, so you can see the kind of overall structure of the argument. So let me sort of plow ahead into this. Everyone invokes the Ummah, but its meaning is unclear and its usage is variable. There's a broad sense of Muslim fraternity, of course, and this has seemed to some an idealized absence, in fact, an obviously impossible goal. To others, it is all too present and menacing. Public attention has been captured by the proclaimed revival of a 7th century institution, the Caliphate, and by justifications of violence in the name of solidarity with embattled Muslim brothers. The horrible murder of Lee Rigby on the street in southeast London to avenge Muslim deaths at the hands of British armed forces. The attackers of the Bataclan in Paris shouting, "C'est pour la Syrie." My intention is to look at the less spectacular and to argue for a presence, not an absence, but a presence, however elusive, that forms part of a contemporary politics of identity. I will argue that it's a rudimentary social imaginary, building on a sense of shared identity, but not translating into a common political project. The lack of comprehensive institutionalization of this identity is a given. I think we just begin with that as accepted. Like the Arab nation, the Ummah has a mobilizing potential and has been politically instrumentalized. But one state or caliphate is, for all intents and purposes, impossible, just as a past of unity has been mythologized. As a social imaginary, it is communitarian, because individuals are thought to acquire meaning through belonging and because of webs of interconnectedness. It also has elements, I will argue, of cosmopolitanism, but this is limited. It's limited in the sense of universalism. It is not cosmopolitan in that sense, although a few hope that it will acquire universality. And we also want to look at whether or not it's cosmopolitan in a second sense, in the sense of internal tolerance. And for that, I will argue that there are distinct challenges today. Muslim and Muslim societies are inexorably interconnected with cultural exchanges, intimate social interactions, and a degree of economic interdependence. I think that's clear. We all recognize that. Building on historical precedents, Islam has been naturally translocal. Over time, Muslims have developed a sense of interconnectedness, even an idealization of unity, as seemingly contradictory events unfolded, as states and parochial identities became entrenched in the Muslim world, and as broader networks have emerged. The Umma, or community of faith, has emerged as one of the central concepts of modern-day Islam, hardened in some quarters into an ideology, even a weapon, but also conceived and represented in diverse cultural forms, as well as in the everyday practice of the faith. All Muslims readily accept the idea of the spiritual unity of Muslims, in line with Quranic references to the one community, the Umma wahida, which is mentioned in the Quran. Travelers very famously traversed Muslim lands in the medieval period, and from the early modern period, Sufi orders, as we know, have spread very widely. The Naqshbandiya, for example, having originated in Bukhara, moved very quickly into the lands of the Ottoman Empire, into Russia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and even North America. The shared intellectual basis of Islam is a defining feature. Ideas and intellectuals have traveled widely, with many assuming that they inhabit a unified domain of knowledge. In addition to the scriptural sources and classic fiqh treatises, we know the scholarly works of such preeminent figures as Ibn Tufayl, and perhaps even more relevant today, Ibn Taymiyyah, are widely read, translated, debated, and in part this is disseminated through the facilitating ages of the internet and social media. So we know that, for example, even the words of contemporary sheikhs and Islamist leaders are regularly followed through these medias. One observer went so far as to call Yusuf al-Qaradawi the virtual caliph. This shared Ummat al-Qutb serves as the basis for madrasa education, but also conditions discussions in other fora throughout the Muslim lands. So it seems to me that that the sense of Muslims constituting or urgently needing to reconstitute one community is very much repeated and affirmed, and that this idea is diffused through social media. Various Islamic symbols have indeed acquired universality, universal currency. And as Charles Taylor reminds us, images, stories, and legends form a critical part of imagining. The most obvious images that are shared, of course, are of the Shahada, of the profession of the faith, also of the Kaaba in Mecca, but there are also other elements, such as the Prophet's footprint or sandals, which appear in diverse societies around the world, from Britain to Syria and Indonesia, and they're immediately recognizable. This is just an example of the kind of current symbols that one would see immediately. Umma land purports to be the Islamic Facebook. We have, of course, a radical representation. The T-shirts, etc., with the one Umma one would see. But a point that I want to make is not just that the Ummah is repeated in kind of popular cultural ways, but that it takes on particular forms as well. So we now have the usage of the rabia, the hand gesture, which is incorporated as part of the universality of the Ummah, but in fact there is a political message inherent in it. It is, of course, meant to be, as it was originally was, to be a statement of solidarity, not essentially with the Ummah, but with the Muslim Brotherhood. But this has now been appropriated in various ways. And the final is a photo taken by a colleague of mine in Istanbul, where boys, children, wanting to have this, so important is it to be identified in this way that they incorporated it into their own personal habits. So I think we can see that these are everywhere. But there are also other forms of sort of images that are not so obvious, but there as well. I mean, if one were to go today into, say, the souk, in virtually any country in the Middle East or South Asia, Southeast Asia, one would see probably on a t-shirt or a hat or something, a representation of the Prophet's footprint or of the sandal. And these are more classical representations of it, but it is something which would be recognizable. And so what on the left, what we have, this is in the British Library. It's from Morocco. It has instructions about how to use it and poetry about it. The bottom one is just from eBay. The kind of trinkets that one might wear is quite popular. The middle one is a mihrab from Damascus. The fourth one is a fairly new from China. Many of you will know the great calligrapher Haji Nuruddin, and this is a representation of his representation of it. And the final one is from London, where an artist called Kashif Masood, who won a prize by depicting this, etc. So what's my point? The point here is that this is a symbol which would be shared and would have meaning. And in fact, when you unpack it, you would see that it has deep meaning for many people. Just for a moment, let me expand on that. Despite the objections of people like Ibn Taymiyyah, despite the objections of some Deobandi sheikhs today, the depiction of the Na'alain, the depiction of the sandals of the Prophet, actually means something to many people. Through the centuries, it has been a tangible reminder of the Prophet and an expression of the hope to receive his grace. It's based on the belief that the Prophet's sandals touched the throne of God, and so therefore not only essentially associated with that, but it is to be demarcated with other prophets. We know from Exodus that Moses was told by God that he had to remove his sandals on Holy Land, but the prophet was not only wore them, but touched the throne of God. And so many people throughout the centuries have carried this as a symbol in their turbans and what they wear, as an amulet in pouches, etc. They would display it in their homes. And as one of the great poems about this says, it is meant to tell us about home, but life in both homes, the earthly home and the eternal home. And so today this image is being repeated and abetted by new technologies, religious and commercial networks. So it commonly appears in jewelry, in artwork, etc., in clothing, in all parts of the Muslim world. And in other aspects of popular culture, the Muslim world is awash with representations of the Ummah in popular music and in visual arts. It draws its inspiration from the pan-Islamic, this reality of pan-Islamic ideas. Increasingly in the modern era, television series, videos, music, cartoons depict historical themes of a pan-Islamic nature. For example, CDs extolling the role of the pan-Islamic Saladin, Salah ad-Din, to Muslim youth can be found in mosques, informal markets that appear outside the main mosques in cities like Kuala Lumpur. The Turkish television series on Suleiman the Magnificent was widely shown throughout the Muslim world, in Indonesia and elsewhere. Popular singers today very consciously use Islamic themes, pan-Islamic themes, solidarity on Islamic issues like Palestine, Syria, etc. Islamic pop music is ever present, from Hisham Abbas's 99 Names of Allah, which are played at elite weddings in the ballrooms of five-star hotels, to Maha Zain's R&B Thank You Allah, to Sami Yusuf's worldwide success, My Umma. New commercial enterprises have emerged which are propagating that. Awakening Records is a UK-based company which does this. Sami Yusuf was famously connected with them more recently. Mesut Turkish and many others, Hamza Namira. One can go on and name various people who sing in various languages. There was a competition, an international competition in London in 2013, won by a young British singer, Harris J., who's just brought out his first album, Salam, and has a worldwide success. And again, the point being that not only do they use these terms, themes, which have an appeal, but they do it in several languages. A particularly good example of this is Maha Zain, Lebanese, Swedish, sings mainly in English, but also Arabic, Turkish, Bahasa, Malay, etc., and various other languages, increasingly popular, etc. So with all of these, there is a conscious effort to plug into a common history and a shared society. At other times, this is implicit. But even when unacknowledged, there's some sense of common belonging as well as of a continuum with ages past. That's registered. So this is popular culture. There's no lack of overt rhetoric on the subject of the Ummah as well. There's been considerable top-down approaches to instill a sense of humor, a sense of Ummah. That's Freudian. That's Freudian. The sense of the Ummah, which is largely state-driven from such would-be leaders as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Malaysia, even Libya, etc. I call this the Ummah industry. Through seemingly endless international conferences, publications, journals, such as the Majalat Arabita, the International Journal of Muslim Unity, the Risalat al-Taqrib, Nahda, and such really governmental, non-governmental organizations as the Muslim World League and the World Islamic Call Society. Through all of these means, transnational sentiment is ostensibly promoted. But in effect, state-shaped messages are disseminated, and the soft power of the state patrons is fostered. But in spite of themselves, is it possible that there is an unintended consequence? By the highlighting of concerns that transcend the established borders of international relations, is it possible that a consciousness is raised among Muslims that does not neatly overlap with state borders? In fact, there are several widespread Muslim representations of the Ummah today, revealing each in turn exaggerated despair, self-serving confidence, and uncomfortable doubt. Nostalgia characterizes the first two, and it's not far distant from the third. If only we could recapture the unity of the prophetic community of believers. If only we could reestablish the golden age. First is the weak Ummah. Some regard the state of the Ummah as powerless, decayed, spiritually bankrupt. This is largely due to the power of the forces arrayed against Muslim aspirations, but it's also self-inflicted. Muslims have been led or allowed themselves to be led astray. Rather than collective unity, there are discontents, troubles of the spirit. Battered by outside aggression, the community's vitality has been further sapped by moral failures. An American-based rap group, in their song Bring Islam Back, laid the blame principally on imperialism and on the local elites who were in league with the imperialists. I'm going to do you a favor and not try to do it as a rap song, but let me just read one stanza. The Umma was once one body undefeated until colonialism crept in and separated us according to land, according to geography, according to nationality. Now we suffer tyranny. You know, this very clear idea that it's imperialism that intruded. One doesn't have to be Anwar al-Awlaki, who was particularly vocal on this subject, to recognize that there are longer lists of Muslim vulnerabilities here. The Yemeni Sufi sheikh, Habib Umma bin Hafiz, puts the primary blame on Muslim errancy, arguing that the weak connections with God, the weak connections with religion, lead to the abasement of the Ummah. We've heard this before. We've heard this regarding the Arab nation, when the catastrophic defeat of 1967 unleashed despair and self-criticism. While secular in tone, the words of the great Iraqi poet Abdul Wahab al-Bayati poignantly capture this point. They killed us before we loved each other. This is the same spirit that suffuses the argument that the Ummah is weak. But then there are those who argue that the Ummah is strong. It's believed that in the geographical expansiveness of the Ummah, in its demographic might, that the worldwide community has real strength. It has resources. It has fellow believers in every part of the globe. It has a natural vitality that comes from solidarity. President Erdogan, who has been acclaimed by some Islamists as the Sultan of the Ummah, is particularly clear on this, a vocal cheerleader for the Ummah. We know the Islamic State in the now famous Nasheed, Ummati Kodlaha Fajrun, My Ummah, the dawn has appeared. It speaks of this assured victory when people forsake this life for the cause of the Ummah. The third is the ambivalent Ummah. As comforting as the idea of solidarity is, it's not immediately obvious to some Muslims how inclusive or tolerant that Ummah is. We know about sectarian or confessional animosity, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. But there are also other markers of difference than sect, notably gender and sexuality, whose place in the order of things remains unsettled. In a poem entitled Home, the British-American gay poet, Kazim Ali, writes of the famous hadith about the cloak, the mantle of the prophet, which he translates as blanket of the prophet, covering the 5 immediate members of the prophet's family. He notes that the Archangel Gabriel may be admitted to that blanketed group if the group so consents, but then asks, is that me at the edge of the blanket asking to be let inside, asking the 800 hadith to be canceled, all history to be reordered? So the question remains for many. And so we do have, in some people's imagination, the idea of an ambivalent Ummah. So I want to show you for a few minutes a few examples. Here, I have a particularly pedantic postgraduate student who, having taken my course, told me that after 11.5 minutes, I must give the class a video to interrupt my monotone. So I'm going to give you one video, one break, which brings together what I think are 4 different ways of looking at this. The first is an apologies to all who can't stand him. The first is Sami Yusuf with this famous song, My Ummah. The reason I give it is because this is easy listening. This will offend many of your sensibilities, I'm sure. This is easy listening. It's an approach which is packaged in such a way to link the singer's star power with an attractive, non-threatening appeal to unity. The glimpse of London that you get is deliberately suggestive. Of all the places to represent the Ummah, it's London which is chosen, which is very interesting, which again demarcates the importance of the minority situation. The weak Ummah is an example of a more sophisticated sort of questioning of the frailties of Muslims, etc. The strong Ummah, you will immediately detect, is bombastic. It's Erdogan of Turkey, basically proposing that the Ummah is great, and wouldn't it be grand if he were to lead it? And so that, of course, comes through very clearly. The subtext very clearly that the Ottoman Empire was a pretty good example of what might be unity in the management of diversity. And the final is just that segment of the nasheed of the Islamic State. But why I mention it is because it's an example of where transcendence is not the point. The point is immanence. That is to say that Muslims should give up this life in order to ensure the triumph of the Ummah in this life. So let's see if I can do this. This is what I want. So again, apologies. Notice that the Ummah is pretty much manipulated here as an extension of his star power. We can bring back the glory of our past. There's London. My Ummah, he will say, Rasulullah, even though we've strayed from him and his way. Look at where we were, look at where we are, tell me, is this how he'd wanted to be? Oh no, let's bring back our glory. Ya Allah, Ya Rabb al-Alameen, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, Ya Rabbi, let the Ummah rise again. This is the argument that Muslims have brought their problems upon themselves.
The Prophet ﷺ said, سَيَأْتِ زَمَانٌ عَلَى أُمَّتِي. There shall come a time upon my ummah, upon my nation, upon the people who follow me, upon the people who believe in me. They call themselves Muslims and believers. My ummah, when their prayers are not prayed correctly, and when high buildings spread in every place, when people swear in the name of Allah a lot about everything without fulfilling their oath, people curse each other a lot, bribery and adultery prevails, people neglect the hereafter in order to buy the luxuries of this world in exchange for the hereafter. So people become materialistic. The Prophet ﷺ said,
This is a clear attempt to relate the Muslim failures
if
to
you
the
see this
failures of
happening in your
humanity
time,
in a kind of a soft,
seek
focused
refuge,
way.
seek refuge. Find a solution to get away from all of this.
Now Erdogan.
Kardeşlerim, hepimiz çok iyi biliyoruz ki eğer istersek, eğer arzu edersek, eğer Hazreti Peygamber Aleyhissalatu Vesselam'ın bize emrettiği istikamette bir elin parmakları gibi birbirimize kenetlenir ve kardeş olmanın gereğini yerine getirirsek bölgemizdeki tüm sorunları kolayca aşabiliriz. Bunun için gerekli güce sahibiz. Bunun için yeterli akla, birikime, tecrübeye sahibiz. Buhara'da, Semerkant'ta, İsfahan'da, Bağdat, Kahire, Gırnat'a, Kurtub'a ve İstanbul'da daha nice şehrimizde tarihte kurduğumuz o parlak medeniyetleri, o barış atmosferini eğer istersek, eğer bir ve beraber olursak yeniden inşa ederiz. Bizim birbirimizle konuşmak için aracılara ihtiyacımız yok. Bizim birbirimizle konuşmak için tercümanlara ihtiyacımız yok. Biz gönül diliyle zaten konuşuyoruz. Biz aynı kıbleye dönen insanlar olarak gönül diliyle, kalp diliyle konuşabilir, aramızdaki meselelere, bölgemizdeki meselelere, hatta yeryüzünde insanlığı ilgilendiren her soruna karşı ortak, etkili bir mücadele verebiliriz. İşte
أشرقت شمس الصمود ولقد سرنا جموعا لربى المجد التليد أمتي فاستبشري قد أشرقت شمس الصمود ولقد سرنا جموعا لربى المجد التليد لنعيد النور والإيمان والعز المجيد برجال طلقوا الدنيا وفازوا بالخلود لنعيد النور والإيمان والعز المجيد برجال طلقوا الدنيا وفازوا بالخلود.
So you get the point.
أمة الأمجاد والنصر.
And the idea that there should be that people must take action to do something in this life, even to the point of self-sacrifice, but it's important that the reestablishment of the Ummah is so important. But what should be clear by now is that there is an unavoidable ambiguity to the concept. There are 49 Quranic references to the Ummah, the one community, the best community beyond the people, Ibrahim as an Ummah. If we were to follow Lane with this great lexicon of Arabic, we know it can be translated as track, path, or way. If we approach the subject sociologically, we know that there are also questions. Is it an association? Is it a society? Is it a community? It's most often thought, because of its interconnectedness plus identity, to be usually translated as community. But is the Ummah a community of fellow travelers, or is it a community of destiny? It's very tempting and makes a tremendous amount of sense to me, at least, to regard the Ummah as a social imaginary of Muslims. It's predicated on an idea of moral order and builds shared understandings of what society should be like. It is aspirational, but meant to be achieved in this life. It is scripturally ordained, yet validated by history. It's largely unarticulated, but it's deployed as an instrument of political legitimization. As a social imaginary, it is unstructured and yet regarded as having once existed in a golden age. It both was and was not. Kan wa ma kan. There are obvious methodological problems with it. Whose Ummah are we talking about? And one of them, of course, is the fluidity of moral orders. Conceptions of moral order travel, migrate over time, and become imbricated with modern social imaginaries, just as natural law moved from Grotius and Locke to the Western European ideas of social welfare democracy. They evolve. Despite these sort of problems, I think what we're talking about, as Taylor tells us, are common understandings, the background, the normal expectations we have of each other, the common repertory. While necessarily imprecise, these understandings, I think, have given us the ability to recognize several things. And those are my points. It tells us about ideal goals, and tells us what fellowship and strangeness is, and it can tell us how we fit together. How do Muslims take together? I've slightly reordered the questions as to what should be done under the goals, who exactly belongs to the Ummah, and how much difference is allowed within the community. I won't take us through all the details of the first point about ideal goals, but simply to make that, of course, it is historically rooted in the abolition of the caliphate, which itself is rooted in the expansion of imperialism and the collapse of local orders in the region, giving rise to sort of a sense of uncertainty, pushing people to think what should replace the caliphate. And the short answer is, of course, that it becomes a question of unity, not so much the caliphate, that there should be some form of unity among Muslims that is galvanizing and creates a kind of a form of sort of a structural harmony. We know that by the time we get to the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, it's quite clear that pan-Islam is being invoked for virtually any other purpose except for the promotion of pan-Islam. Putting it simply, it's used for the promotion of state power, whether that be Saudi Arabia, whether that be Iran or Pakistan, etc. All of them use, of course, the means of Islam to defend themselves, etc. So it seems to me it's not an attack upon the state system per se, but really, how does one make states Muslim? I'm reminded also of what Sami Zubaydah told us, that there's a potent combination of authoritarian regimes and their populist constituencies. And what did this induce? Insularity, parochialism, etc. So this is quite clearly the case, but at the same time, we have the stirrings of transnational elements, whereby people were coming together to talk about what should replace the caliphate. Was the state itself an acceptable institution? And we know that in this process of rethinking it, Muslim minorities played a particularly strong role. And even though they were not present in the majority countries, they've had a tremendous influence in the formation of ideas outside the majority Muslim world, but not outside the Ummah, and in fact, great players in it. So in a sense, the answer to the first question about ideal goals, what should be done, it should be the establishment of a form of unity. And this is consistent with a Muslim rhetorical trope, which is family-centered. Muslims constitute one brotherhood. All are children or grandchildren of the Ummah. At times, to indicate despair at current circumstances, they are orphans of the Ummah. This is what Roger Smith called a story of peoplehood. And through these formalized presentations, and particularly through transnational media, these get repeated. The Ummah becomes, in a sense, an element of the faith. In the language of Amitai Etzioni, it's a communitarian idea. There are effective cross-cutting relationships across nationality, ethnicity, and class, and a commitment to the idea of a common culture. So the second question, who belongs to the Ummah? Who are the fellows? Who are the adherents of it? And who are the strangers? Here there's considerable debate. There's Quranic justification for believing that every faith group has its own Ummah. We know this from Surat Yunus and others. Each was sent its own messenger, and they will be judged with justice. But there are various modern interpretations of this. Sheikh Sharawi, for example, of Egypt, took a rather liberal view, saying that who belongs in the Ummah? Those Muslims who are actively engaged, but also those Muslims who are not particularly devout, but were nevertheless born into the faith. Invoking Sharawi, an American Muslim feminist, Tamara Gray, extends it quite far into a third category, says the Ummah incorporates those of other faiths. Much hangs on the philosophical question of who are the strangers, who are like us, who are not. And there are many variations on this theme. Ibrahim is the symbol of inclusiveness. The Qur'an says that he was neither a Jew nor a Christian. He was among those of certain faith. He was a true believer. He was an upright Muslim, Hanifan Musliman, suggesting that whoever submits to the one God, monotheists, belong in the Ummah. But other modern interpretations are more judgmental, stimulated by a basic debate about whether Muslims can be friends. Many of you will know of this contentious concept of loyalty and disavowal, al-wala wal-bara. The bifurcation inherent in the concept is enhanced by reference to the Quran, in the Quran, which approves of Ibrahim's dissociation from the polytheists and declares enmity for those who do not accept the one God. Maududi translates that as disapproval, but there's a harder interpretation which has emerged. The modern Salafi interpretations, such as Sheikh Salah al-Fazan, says Muslims should not take non-Muslims as friends or receive support from unbelievers. Radical Salafists go further. Abu Muhammad Maqdisi said quite clearly, hate infidels as well as hating their ways and their laws. We've all heard of Umma Bakri Muhammad's boast that the flag of Islam would one day fly over Downing Street. So taking the matter at face value and putting it crudely, will we all, as non-Muslims, will we someday be part of the Ummah? Well, all communities, whether ethnic, racial, national, ideological, etc., make comparisons with outsiders. But in this particular case, there is a spectrum of Muslim thought which ranges from the more accepting of the stranger to directly hostile attitudes. Liberal sentiment would call for the peaceful coexistence with non-Muslims, even toleration. Conservatives, such as Saudi Arabia, would say that while non-Muslims, especially fellow monotheists, should be respected, they are eventually to be called to Islam, as the Quran enjoins, willing conversion then, not subjugation. The radical viewpoint is more aggressive in saying that it's an imperative to unite mankind under the Islamic banner. Islamic rule can be imposed. So in this second question of who is the Ummah, it really has to do with whether or not this cosmopolitan idea of universalism applies. And what I would like to suggest is that it doesn't, in the sense that all faiths are not represented or included in an accepting or respectful way. As categories persist, believer and non-believer, loyalty and disavowal, boundaries are reaffirmed rather than undermined. So the Ummah is understood here as geographically dispersed, but distinctive, widespread, but not forming the encompassing ecumenical whole. The third question, how does it all fit together? How do Muslims fit together? Is an increasingly important question. I could go on here about the various ways it's looked at. Just take one example. Hafiz Saeed was the ideologue of Lashkar Toiba in South Asia. Actually makes a distinction between Muslims and mu'mineen. Muslims are the believers. The Muslims are okay. They carry the venerable name of Muslim, but they're passive agents of their fate. Whereas the believers, the mu'mineen, are actually, they're the model to follow. They've acted on, they've proven their faith, and they've most often done this through participation in jihad. Also of critical importance here is the question of the hypocrites, the munafiqeen. Who are they? Contemporary writers like Qaradawi and Ayman al-Zawahiri, as diverse as that, actually lump them together with the unbelievers. The hypocrites are the unbelievers. And in a way, on a scale, somewhere between belief and unbelief, the hypocrites are generally somewhere in the middle here. But in modern parlance, it's being moved much more towards, and even sometimes coterminous with, unbelief. And so those who we do not believe are proper Muslims are hypocrites, but they are virtually the same as unbelievers, with all the consequences that flow from it. And of course, the real conversation stopper in this issue is that of sectarianism. And we know that the problems of this have been increasing in the modern world, but has been there, remind us before. The 12th century tract, Talbis Iblis, of course, the devil's deception, attacked Shiism and Sufism is unacceptable. More recently, we have witnessed the Wahhabi anathematizing of the Shia. Saudi textbooks hammer home the dangers of polytheism, shirk, the veneration of saints, visitation to shrines, mourning for Ali, haram. A 9th grade textbook distinguishes between the kuffar, the unbelievers, and the fasiq, the unrighteous, the godless, who are the Shia and the Sufis. And of course, we add to that the politicized confessionalism that we know exists in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere today. But there's also intra-sect disputes, in part theological, but perhaps mainly now a function of the contestation of authority. My time is running out, but I want to give you one example because it's so relevant and contemporary. Take, for example, an intra-Sunni debate. There is no doubt that the Saudi religious officials have been instrumental in developing a Wahhabi Salafi interpretation, which is at least the godfather, if not the father, of a virulent sectarianism and jihadism that turns against its own. Well, Al-Qaeda and ISIS denounced the Saudi religious class. The genealogy of sectarian animosity is undeniable, despite what the Saudi state says. So, although ideologically related, the Saudi official ulama are not only articulating a counter message to the Islamic State, but they're seeking to delegitimize the messenger. So take the current debate over the renewer, Mujaddid, for example. The relevant hadith says, Allah will raise for the Ummah at the end of every 100 years the one who will renew its religion. ISIS has invoked this, ostensibly in support of the Caliph, and the Saudis have called the concept into question. But we know that they say, just as the Islam in the 7th century was brought to purge the peninsula of innovations and myths, the Saudi Wahhabi alliance of the 18th century did the same thing in the Arabian Peninsula. It brought about a double renewal. It brought about religious reform, Islah Dini. It brought about political reform, Islah Siyasi. The establishment ulama, therefore, are wary of any other top-down renewal, but they have to tread carefully. Why? Because the hadith is sahih. The hadith is universally recognized as valid, widely accepted. And so their reasoning is delicate here. If properly understood, the concept of renewer has very limited applicability in the modern world because it has the potential for abuse. And in any case, other injunctions herald the finality of revelation and the perfection of God's message. So the Ummah needs proper guidance, unsurprisingly, their own. My point is that here an intra-sectarian debate is of course fostered and manipulated for the purposes of legitimizing authority. And so the entire idea of the unity of the Ummah comes down to who speaks for it, who controls it. So to answer the third question, how much internal difference is allowed in this? How do we fit together? Well, I have to put it frankly, not especially well. That there are obviously polarizing differences that have been a fact of life, and that these are very much there. That the internal divisions within the Muslim world have been particularly awkward in a religion which says that its default position is brotherhood. So to put it pretty candidly, as the Ummah is moving from a moral imaginary to a social construct, thanks to the idealization of a common culture and transnational exchanges, the dividing lines within are getting stronger. are getting more reified. Let me conclude. A complex political geography has emerged which seems to undermine the very idea of a Muslim world. States, non-state actors, social movements, religious and lay intellectuals make up a diversified modern Islam. So diverse is the phenomenon that the idea that there are Islams rather than Islam has become a dominant motif in the academic literature. My argument is we cannot go too far with that perspective. Muslims themselves clearly see the belonging to a definable, perhaps even palpable presence in their lives. We ought to take that seriously. In fact, to my mind, there is a kind of social imaginary present which builds on a common idealized moral order. This may not explain behavior of the individual, but it helps us to understand the construction of the individual's priorities. The entire exploration of the Ummah today is characterized by several tensions. First is the tension between authenticity and hybridity. Many, if most, would argue that they are reestablishing a golden age, which is thought to be the true Islam. But the reality is of difference, competitor identities of the nation, ethnicity, hybridity, as one would expect of the modern world. There's also tension between the explicit and the implicit. Implicit is the common sense of connectedness, the visiting of graves, the visiting of shrines, the concern for endangered Muslims around the world. As one of my informants told me, we are brothers who are not yet brothers. But the sense of the Ummah can be explicit. Clifford Geertz reminded us that religious persuasion is an instrument of public identity. It can be manipulated, it can be negotiated. And there's a lot of the top-down manipulation, pan-Islamism as an ideology, the Ummah industry. Add to this the communitarian cosmopolitan debate that I've talked about. The Ummah is communitarian in the sense that the individual is fulfilled, in critical part, by recognition of belonging to a greater enterprise. On one defined liberal and one defined illiberal reading of the Qur'an and of the Ummah, it professes to be relevant to all mankind. But most interpretations have not come to terms with the strangeness of strangers. Perhaps more importantly in today's world, in the other sense of how Muslims fit together, tolerance of difference and pluralism is limited. We know that transnational theory has given us another expectation, that it would lead to new identities, new communities of identities. As I've suggested, there's something to this. There's increasingly something to this aspect, probably in large part abetted by the failure of states, the expansion of globalized communications, etc., their ability to objectify and familiarize people with themselves. One young British Muslim has argued that this gaining of weight leads us to a thin Ummah today rather than a thick Ummah. There's some common sense to this characterization. It's roughly what I mean by the emergence of a social imaginary. But I've also argued that there are discontents. So should we be optimistic or pessimistic? Ashamin has given us a framework to think optimistically. In Land of Strangers, he regards the tension between fellows and strangers both inevitable and invigorating. It allows for publics and counterpublics to rub against each other in a way that allows for mature self-expression. But as I've also argued, the appropriation of the Ummah for sustaining particularized authority and the general attempt to capture spiritual universalism in bounded and controlled categories is something which can be self-defeating. Muslim, non-Muslim, believer, infidel, Islamist secular, Sunni Shia, Wahhabi Salafi, Saudi Islam, Iranian Islam. One could reasonably conclude that the Ummah deserves better and is unlikely to get it. But the lived reality of religious traditions, the lived reality of religious traditions is change and fluidity. And the lived reality of Muslim politics is that it is in substantial part shaped by this fluid religious reality. To write off the Ummah as merely a self-serving and idealized distraction would be to miss an evolving politics of identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this wonderful and thought-provoking and absolutely brilliant talk. You've given us so much to think about, and the question of the meaning of the Ummah for contemporary Muslims is very challenging, and you've just really showed us the richness of how we can think about it. So thank you very much, and I would like to now open the floor for questions and comments. Just to say that I will take 3 questions at a time. We have about half an hour. I believe that there will be a reception following this, and there will be opportunity to speak with Professor Piscatori after. But so I'll just start with number of questions. I see 1, 2, yes, okay, and Shireen. So please.
Thank you. Adil Khan from the Department of Religion here in SOAS. Could you kindly show the front slide again so that I can ask the question? Or is it all right? It was in search of the Ummah, and there was a term discontents in there.
Discontents, yeah.
Yes. So I was hoping to hear more about the discontents, but I wonder if they were your discontents, or were they discontents of the you know, sort of people of the ilk of ISIS who are in search of the Ummah, if you know what I mean. So, I mean, as an analyst, wouldn't you want to take a middle ground between someone like me, who's a part-time Muslim, if you'll allow that expression, and for me, someone like me and many like me, who perhaps would consider it a social imaginary, not the social imaginary.
Okay, thank
if
you.
you allow that.
Yeah, good.
Thanks very much for your talk, Professor Piscatori. I wanted to ask about how modern conceptions of the Ummah relate to local territorial nationalisms, and the extent to which they rub against one another or overlap.
Many thanks for your excellent talk. My question is, do you think that this idea and the political function of the Islamic Ummah are unique, or are there parallels in other Abrahamic faiths? I mean, one can think of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation or the various Christian responses that were invoked by the Trump candidacy and various other things. And if you think it's unique, what are the reasons why it is unique and why we don't have that idea in there?
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for 3 excellent questions. The discontents was my sort of take on it. It was my attempt to have something sexy in the title. So it wasn't even that thought out. So yeah, it was, and indeed it was what I was referring to, and specifically were those, what I see as the problems built into it. So, and I think you make a kind of methodological point. It's sort of my take on what the problems were and are. And some of it, to some extent, of course, that overlaps with what Muslims themselves have said. But I guess what I was arguing is if we take this as sort of a rough idea, that it should give you, that this idea of an imaginary building on some idea of a moral order should do something for us. Right? It should be somehow organizing in a way, orientating in a way, and it should sort of basically tell us about what's the ideal, roughly. It should tell us something about how we fit in with others who are not part of that community. Who are we defining as not part of that community? And maybe the last bit, which is where I suppose I put more emphasis and where I see more of the discontents, is that I don't think the question of how do we fit together has been settled. And that's however you want to otherwise say it, whether it's pluralism or tolerance, etc. It really does come down to the question, are you going to accept that the other's opinion and position is valid? Are you going to accord them a certain amount of legitimacy? And that, of course, isn't occurring very often. And the sort of the sense of the other is beyond the pale, is beyond a border, because they don't do what I want, etc., is quite strong. Now, whether it's unique, and I'll come to your point, I don't think it's particularly unique to Islam, but I think that's one of the problems, and so it's there. Where does a part-time Muslim fit? It's a good question. I mean, I suppose what I would argue, in a way, I'm taking this from some people like Abdulaziz Sachedina, from Ashamin and others, who would take a broad stroke approach to this and say, it's a broad house. We have all kinds of people here. But the point is not that there should be one dominant way of looking at it. But what is non-negotiable is that we must all accept that the other's position is valid, that nobody has the right to delegitimize your position within the Ummah. You have a right to be there. And what that kind of final answer is a matter of disputation, and it probably will never be arrived at. But it requires that kind of openness and acceptance of the other's validity. Territorial, national, they're together in a sense. And of course, we know, even if one were to take a fairly abstract way of looking at this, even theoretically, we know that transnationalism can't exist without nationalism. We know that the local must be there with the global, that they can't be, that they're in a sense complementary forces rather than antagonistic. So in this sense, the territorial aspect of Islam is inherent. And so we're never talking here about some sort of ethereal ummah, though, of course, many people in sort of social media circles will purport that there is something which floats above. It can't. It has to have roots within the local society. And so that's definitely there. And in a more political way, as I try to argue, we're never going to get rid of the state either. So the way to look at this probably is to say, the transnationalism of Islam, the Ummah side of it, doesn't displace the state system, but it affects it. It has an influence on it. And of course, the question which is debated in the literature and by policymakers as well is how important is that affecting of it? Does power shift as a result of it? That still remains to be seen. But there's a complementarity there to a certain extent. Are they unique? Is the Islamic case unique? No. I think the unity and diversity projects are everywhere. We've seen them. We've seen all kinds of pan movements. It's the same sort of thing. I suppose the difference is, and I've got to think this out, the difference is that there is, in the case of Islam, a clearer theological imperative for the creation of a community, and justified in what we would call religious terms, right? The Qur'an says, God said that you should do this. Now, Charles Taylor, in his book on social imaginary, makes a good point. He says that he doesn't exactly talk about Islam, but he says there is a Christian type of this as well, but the Christian at the end is transcendental. It is otherworldly. The Christian Ummah will be realized in the next life, not now. And the point that I was trying to make about ISIS is, and just of all of them is that it's now. And we're not putting off everything. It's not salvationist in that sense. It's to make our life better now, the here and now. It's the dunya, which is full of problems, yes, but one of the ways in which we can reform the ummah, the dunya, is to have this world, is to have this ummah. So I think in that sense it might be different. But the broader sense of a unity, of course, occurs in others as well.
Okay. So Roger, and then yes.
I wonder whether without globalization, the whole idea of the Ummah might have withered and died.
Might wither in time.
And died.
That without globalization, the whole idea of the Ummah might have withered, as the BBC would have told me to say, withered and died, would have remained an elite thing. State elites would not have achieved this extraordinary popularization which you've touched on in so many aspects of your lecture.
Yeah. Yes.
Many thanks, Professor Piscatori, for your very thought-provoking lecture just now. My question is the word social imaginary itself. Where does the social imaginary came from? Was it like from the romanticizing of the past history of Islam, where Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih managed to get over Constantinople over the Byzantine? Or do you think that there are many other mediums or whatnots that affects the social imaginary among Muslims today? Thank you.
Okay, one more question. Okay, in the back there, please.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering throughout, as you were speaking, what role does the Charter of Medina play in this imagining of the Ummah? Because it includes Ummah and it defines it as including Muslims, Jews, and others. It was dictated by the Prophet, and it was supposed to be the constitution which was supposed to run the community of Muslims in Medina when they migrated from Mecca. And it includes Jews, Muslims, and others. And I'm just wondering what role it plays in this imagining of Ummah amongst Muslims these days, and why is it widely ignored?
Do you mean the function that the others play in stimulating the Ummah idea? Or do you mean how are they incorporated within the Ummah?
So I'm not sure if you read the Charter of Medina itself. It explicitly says that this is what the community, the Ummah, is supposed to do, the Muslims, the Jews, and the others.
I gotcha. Yeah. Right. Okay. So, Roger, I'm not going. It's a provocative question, something to think about. But you sparked something in my mind, which is the point about, and I guess it's quite clear. And I wonder, I have to self-examine myself here as to whether or not I've done it too. I think I probably have slipped into the timeless motif. I'm critical of that. I don't want to make that argument. I want to make the argument that what we're talking about in terms of the Ummah is actually a very modern thing. It is the result of globalizing forces, or modernity, modern education, objectification, socialization, etc. It's the result of those modern processes that we have this consciousness of this. Whether there was, and I think that I'm just kind of, assuming that there was probably a less explicit version of it. The implicit part of this was always there to some extent. A kind of an instinctive, we belong, this is with each other, instinctive solidarity, instinctive brotherhood, etc. But the making of it manifest, the making of it hard, the making of it objectified is a kind of modern process. But at the same time, it therefore makes it more of an instrument. It increases its instrumentality, its usefulness. So again, a theme which I didn't develop really well, apologies, and I really meant to develop it better, was to say that we're not a million miles away from a straight political analysis about authority. That at the end of the day, this concept, through various processes, becomes more manifest, becomes more important, and it does all those things I'm talking about. It has resonance in popular culture. People care about it. It affects the way people think in various ways. It might motivate people to shoot people. It might do all those sort of things too. But boy, does it have a clearer political utility to the would-be controllers of the Ummah. The Saudis, the Iranians, etc. What better way to legitimize yourself than to say you speak for the Ummah? And everything that I've talked about has enhanced their ability to do it. So I guess I'm stuck with this kind of odd, almost incompatible, sort of uncomfortable sort of simultaneity of forces. On the one hand, I do think it's there, it's becoming more important, people feel it. On the other hand, states feel it, authority, they get it too. And so it makes them able to use it in a way. So we have two different tendencies and processes which are unfolding, and that's going to make things very difficult. The question of social imaginary, yeah, good question. Well, I don't have a clear answer to this. And I'm gratified and happy to report that neither does Charles Taylor, neither do any of those who promote this idea. There is an, you trace the philosophical isnad here, you trace the philosophical genealogy, and you're sort of stuck with, I think so. My interpretation, but you do put your finger on an important point here, which is that there's something that must give rise to this idea. You must be observing something. Now, I started to detail the methodological problems, and I didn't go through them. It's, who's Islam? What about hierarchies? Is everyone's view of the Ummah equal? And surely the whole idea throughout Islamic's history is that many would argue, again, the appropriation of learning as a form of authority. Many would argue that, no, I know more than you do. And so your view, you're nobody. The Khassa and Amma sort of classical division within Islam would be there too. So that's a built-in problem. The overlapping of identities, this point that there are ethnic and national and territorial identities as well. So there are built-in methodological problems. What's the best shot I have? The best shot, and this is something that has to be developed, is that you look at those who have interpreted these things over time. So you do look at, in our period, you do look at the Abdus and the Afghanis and all the major figures that everybody talks about. You may, the current writers and thinkers, etc. In other words, you do look at intellectuals. What does Taylor say? You look at Grotius. You look at John Locke. You look at Pufendorf. You look at the articulators of natural law tradition. So for us, that would be the articulators of the theological traditions of the moment. So it does mean that we're looking at elites, we're looking at intellectual elites as a way of doing it, but it is interpretive at the end, absolutely. And yes, the covenant of the Charter of Mecca, the Constitution of Medina, obviously has these four parts of it which talked about the regulation of relations, etc. I'm talking more than that, and I think you're right to say that if we were to look at the prophetic period, the period of the 7th century, that we have an example of where friends and strangers do work together. And that is something that is really, I think that ought to be noted. It's just that we have the uncomfortable feeling that the 7th century does not the 21st century make. We're just talking about completely different social circumstances. And so we don't know enough about the 7th century, first of all, and certainly the present conditions are so different that it would be hard to draw a straight line. So therefore, I am critical. I acknowledge the point you're making, but I'm also critical of any simple conclusion that's paradigmatic, that serves as a model. The conditions are so different that I don't think it can. We have to look to the modern conditions to give us guidance there.
Okay, we have a bit of time for another round, perhaps 2-3 questions. Okay, I'll see someone in the back there. Okay, sorry, so we're going to take this question first and then the back. Okay, thanks.
Jim, thank you very much. A terrific talk and really interesting. Set me thinking. There's quite an interesting paradox that you've laid out in some ways, is that in some senses, and I think it's good to use the notion of the Ummah as a social imaginary, because its death is politics, in the sense that the more you use it, the more you lose it, and yet the temptation is always to use it. So as you said, when it's instrumentalized, when it's bounded, when it's tied to a state project, it begins to disintegrate. It leads people to extraordinary ambition, defeats them, even though they think in using it, they're enhancing their worldly power. So I was trying to get a sense, therefore, of whether it is a very peculiar, and perhaps, as Shireen said, not necessarily a unique political concept, because it's something that is powerful in the imagination, but completely flawed as an instrument of statecraft, and therefore, in a sense, a fatal political trap.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you think that ISIS is part of Ummah?
And there's someone behind as well, yes? Just right behind you. Yes? No? Okay, that's fine then, thank you. Okay, so just in the back there, please. Last question.
I don't know how I'm going to top that last question, but okay. So thank you for your talk. When you're talking about the Ummah in the 21st century, and you're talking about modern politics in Iran and Saudi Arabia, would you go as far as to say that there would be this split, this binary within the Ummah, which would split it to the point where we can maybe no longer call it an Ummah because we are so divided? There is such a how do I put it? Such a clear, stark contrast between those on one side and those on the other. What are your thoughts? Thank you.
Wow, all great questions at the end here. Charles, I'm going to turn it back on you. Absolutely, I see exactly what you're saying is absolutely correct. You put it beautifully, much better than me. But I wonder, and this is a question for, this is you, this is Reem too. Could not one say this about Arab nationalism? Could not one say the same sort of debates about Arab? the Umma Arabiya, absolutely. And the same sort of thing. In other words, it stands out as an idealized aspiration. Everybody thinks that unity is good. Everybody wants it. There's something there. You feel an Arab. Anasa, through rhetorical means, etc., can play on it, gets a rise out of it. There's a popular cultural industry which sort of promotes it in a way. And then at the end of the day, what is it? It's just manipulated. Now, of course, the mistake, and I was trying to say this clearly, I think Sami would himself argues this, very clearly we mustn't be thinking in terms of it translating. We're not thinking of the Islamic United Arab Republic. We're not thinking of the one state. We're not thinking of the caliphate as the end result of the Ummah. I mean, that's a given. That's not going to happen. But there has been that sort of dimension of the debate as well. So it's more in terms of what function does the Ummah Arabiyya play? And it functions partly as an ideology of rule, partly as an ideology of protest as well, right? So in other words, it has political functions. Does it serve as a galvanizing factor? I think it did. I think it does. I'd be interested to hear what the Arabists say here. I mean, the argument here is that there's supposed to be the nationalism and Arab nationalism. They're supposed to be the opposites, right? But in fact, they overlap. So, the famous example of Egypt, but others as well. So that you enhance the localized identity through the translocal identity. And so there's a playing up. So it has a function. So I think, I'm not giving an answer, but I think there are other examples, and I think of Arab nationalism as the same sort of thing. And in a way, it toodles along, doesn't it? We all admit it died. We all admit it failed, but yet we still talk about it. In some ways, and there are in a contextualized circumstances, in certain circumstances it gets rises again, and so it might be the same case with the Ummah. But the analogy is something to think about for sure. Excellent, succinct question, which I wish to avoid the answer to. Is ISIS a part of the Ummah? Very, very good question. Okay, a cowardly reply. A cowardly reply is that it's not my job to make that decision. It is for Muslims to think about that. I guess what I was saying was more the empirical fact that they are obviously players in the sense that they have a clearly defined view of what they think it is. This is what Taylor calls prescriptive imaginary. They're not just saying you want to get the Ummah in order to have a better life. You want to kind of think about a standard of good and bad. You're going way beyond that. You're saying this is what you have to do to have the proper Ummah. And if you don't do that, you are not part of the Ummah. You're out of it. And therefore, that is just drawing more and more boundaries and leading to intolerance. So I think the answer would be that, in a kind of a general sense, everybody's part of it, in a way. But it leads to those questions that I was trying to articulate. Who are the hypocrites? Who are those who dissent from your interpretation of Islam so off the scale that you now think of them as hypocrites, unbelievers, disbelievers, etc., kuffar, etc. That is where it becomes a sort of a dangerous game, but it's something that is really Muslims need to contend with. What's going to happen in the rest of the 21st century? I think those sort of disputes, you put it as binary. I think that's partly true. I guess the point, again, that I didn't have time to develop is that I think it's more than binary, but your larger point is true. I think that there's a lot of internal fragmentation. And that's not just Sunni Shia. That's not just Saudi Arabia, Iran. As I was trying to develop in a very quick sort of way, there's Shia, there's Sunni, there's Salafi. Who's the proper Salafi? All of that's going on. In fact, one of what seems to me regrettable, and perhaps I should not make a personal statement, but what does seem certainly notable of the current period is that not just that difference exists, but there is an accentuation of difference. That the demarcation of difference has become the norm. And so, the West is rushing to catch up with the Trumpian sort of deterioration of civil discourse. Well, as an outsider, forgive me for saying it, there's been a deterioration of civil discourse within Muslim societies. This inability to accept others as part of the faith, and doing so in terms which are so laden with enmity, so charged, so negative, that it does make you wonder, where is the unity of the Ummah? That cannot be productive for future harmony. So I think that kind of tension is there and will continue to be there for some time, very sadly.
Well, I don't know if I can use the prerogative of the chair and ask
Why not?
one final question. I mean, you've raised so many issues and questions for us this evening, and I want to just follow up on your response to Charles and some of your responses. I mean, in your talk, we get the sense that there is quite a bit of tension in this social imaginary on the various meanings of the Ummah, and yet it would have been, and what I want to get a sense from you then, the territorial division, the national division, and so on, how do they shape different understandings of the Ummah? I mean, you've touched on this. In a sense, I mean, I think, and this is just a gut feeling, intuitive, and maybe would sound blasphemous to say that, for Arabic-speaking members of this Ummah, actually the Ummah is Arab.
Absolutely. I was speaking to a sheikha in Kuwait within the last sort of year, and this is precisely what she said. She said, okay, let's stop. When you say the Ummah Islamiyya, you really mean the Ummah Arabiyya, don't you? I said, part of the problem here, Sheikha, is exactly what many people would say.
So to just end on a light note, so Muslims may want the Khilafah, but do they want to be under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi?
No, this is...
Or under Erdogan.
Anyone.
Exactly, the Sultan of the Ummah. No, I mean, I think this is quite clear, and that many of those tensions then come to the fore, and but perhaps I should add that to my list of tensions at the end, that in a way, people have within them certain ideas of what it should be. If it's going to be a caliph, we know classical thinking on this, it's got to be an Arab, right? And the Arab world has got to be at the center of it. Well, we have the Erdogan coming on board. We have the Malaysians and the Indonesians who are, and we all know the Cambridge History of Islam in the 1970 edition made the distinction between the center and the periphery. Dale's written about this. And obviously that is not the case now. The periphery, Malaysia and Indonesia, is actually promoting many ideas here, which a moribund sort of Arab world isn't. So I think, but I think your point is right, that kind of built-in assumption is there, and that is another way that works against it. So, yeah, maybe we have to be talking about micro-ummas,
the many ummas,
sub-ummas.
Well, again, I just want to say thank you so much for such an enriching and brilliant talk and thought-provoking, and we're really grateful for you to be with us this evening. Thank you.